reality becomes blurred because of the dopamine. Your brain just wants more of the dopamine. It's accustomed to getting it where it gets it,
Yeah.
whether that be gambling. And in this case, for most people, it's these parasocial relationships that are hypersexual.
And what's going on in the brain? I think I heard you talk about this. I listened to a bunch of your videos this morning. I know I told you so. I think there was one where you were talking about like literally it physically changes the brain and the way that it functions and the way that it looks in terms of size and functionality. Can you speak a little bit to what happens to the brain?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been multiple studies that show that not only does it change functionality or performance, that's what I mostly look at, and I've measured it myself, but it does change functioning. It changes the structure also. We know that the white and the gray matter become smaller. So basically, brains are underdeveloped in terms of structure and function. The underdevelopedness of function, which I find to be mind blowing actually, is that brains develop until the age of 28 on average. So most people are finding porn. And now in today's day and age, they're finding social media, these relationships, influencers, everything we've been discussing at younger and younger ages. Porn exposure is down to 8 on average now. And that's
Eight
because
years
everybody has a
old?
phone at 8 years old. So, and that doesn't mean necessarily a person started consuming it regularly, but what we know from another scientific study is the earlier the age of exposure, the more frequent and consistent a person consumes porn. That's why early age of
Addict.
exposure is very dangerous. And then it leads to 3 different reinforcement loops as I see it. And I've kind of put this together from multiple studies, but you're exposed to porn at an earlier age, which means you do go back to it earlier than if you weren't exposed to later. Then you go onto social media and we have this consumer consumed. We also know that that then shows up in DMs. Boys 14 years old send more than 70% send unsolicited genital pictures and they request nudes from girls at the age of 14. So this is a reinforcement loop. This is happening across the country, at least the country. And then the last reinforcement loop is then it shows up in the real world because these boys are sending these DMs. Now girls are interacting with them and we have these distorted relationships. That's 3 reinforcement loops. And back to my point is that all of them are decreasing function and structure in those brains that would have developed in such a healthy way up until the age of 28. When that first exposure happens and when these reinforcement loops become consistent, brain development is completely derailed. That's where the damage and the dysfunction and the destruction come from. Because now you have, 18 years of distorted miswiring happening instead of wiring and hardwiring into the healthy pattern. And it's all substantiated by scientific studies. And just to give you one more just easy way to think about it, what happens at that first exposure is the brain gets flooded with dopamine. That molecule I already talked about. When it gets flooded, it calibrates in the first exposure to need more dopamine the next time to get the same feeling, the same sensation. It's actually a protective mechanism, but it immediately leads to tolerance building. So when a person goes back pretty soon after that first exposure, they need more dopamine and it's off to the races in terms of tolerance and escalation. Those are the seeds of addiction. If you never water them, they don't grow. If you do water them, they do grow.
And then you have these young people who have misconceptualized relationships, but also like intimacy and sex. And then you have, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but then you're escalating because you're so young and you're chasing that first hit or, that first high as an addict is doing, right? And then you have these people that are having unrealistic sexual relationships where people could get hurt, people could it could become abusive. It's just total misalignment.
Yeah, it does often. It does. That's exactly what we're seeing scientifically. And, back to the 50 Shades of Grey, I put it in my book that when those movies came out, sex toy injuries went through the roof. Nobody considers
Jeez.
that though. Like everyone's talking about their sex rooms and their toys and all that, except for there's a lot of people being injured because of it. So, and then we know too, there's scientific studies that show that choking is up, and up as something that men like and they're doing more often, choking their partner. And it goes back to what you said, like, how did that become part of a person's sexual arousal template? No porn, that never becomes part of the arousal template because you're not seeing it over and over and over, giving your brain dopamine associated with choking. That's how that is now, kind of dripping into people's actual sex lives. Without porn, the arousal templates wouldn't become distorted like they are.
Because again, you're escalating, and it's probably not something that happens overnight when you're 14 or whatever, or 8, God forbid. It's
Hmm.
funny because I think back too. I was just thinking while you were talking about the 8-year-old. My nephew's 9. I can't even imagine, but I don't want to think about that. But I was thinking about, like, what was
I
the
know
first
nobody does.
time? Yeah.
Nobody does. And just to frame it too, like I said, I have 5 kids. So really a silver lining of my work has been it's allowed me to talk with them pretty openly. Obviously, I talk about it all the time openly, but to really help them, forge healthy, intimate relationships. And honestly, it's changed my parenting. Now they're young adults. Like, they will bring their boyfriends and girlfriends and they'll stay at the house. Like, before all this, I wouldn't have done that. And then my youngest is 14. We continue to talk about things that are uncomfortable for me and her, but it allows us to do it, and that's the way
Yeah.
you help communication. I always joke the most terrifying thing, you think I've talked about some challenging things, communicate with your people, talk to them about this stuff, you know, that's the
Yeah.
most terrifying.
That's, I mean,
Yeah. And
I
if,
can't
if I
even.
can, if I can just tell you one more thing, I just had a
Please.
recent conversation with, I think he was like 19 or 20, a young man who he didn't even know he was saying this until I gently showed it to him. He was talking about how, he had a porn habit since he was 10. That's what I talk to people. And then he said he went to be with his partner for the first time and he couldn't get aroused. But this is what he said is because it was so vanilla. And I'm like, wait a second here, back up, because some gorgeous woman wants to be with you but you think it's vanilla. She actually wants to be with you. I'm like, but
Like,
it's
yeah.
too quote unquote vanilla for you because you've conditioned your brain for a decade. Like the thought of that was too vanilla would never cross the non porn exposed brain. And that's exactly what I'm talking about with the reinforcement loops. And then it
Gosh,
leads to ED in 20-year-olds.
I was going to say the amount of people. So I'm 40. I just turned 40 a couple months ago. But the amount of
Nice.
people over the last 10, maybe even 15 years that are like my age or a little bit younger, maybe a little bit older, using ED medication, whether that's what's the one, Tadaf, whatever they are,
Viagra,
Viagra, and
Cialis.
other. Yeah, Cialis. That's the one I was thinking of. Yeah, yeah. The amount of people that have been using that already is like, I remember I'd be like, what? Like, do you have a problem already? Like, you're in your peak. You should.
Mhm.
And do you think this contributes to like the lower testosterone that
I was
men
just
have
gonna
now?
say
Okay.
that literally that's why because so many men take ED meds and testosterone replacement. TRT is on almost every intake of people I work with. And I pose the question, why do you think you need testosterone replacement? Like that early on in my career with all this, I'm like, all the men that are on testosterone that shouldn't have a testosterone problem. So without looking at porn and hypersexual consumption, like without looking at it, you're not looking at the whole picture. And I have
That's what I
personally
was
seen
at.
it. I have personally seen it. First of all, we know that ED in young men has more than doubled in the last decade. It's going to continue the trajectory. And, someone recently joked with me that you can't watch anything without getting ED pill ads.
Oh,
You know what I mean?
100%.
Like
Oh, yeah.
they're everywhere because the industries aren't stupid. The pharmaceutical industry, the tech industry, they all know where this is leading. But you need a certain level of arousal in your brain. So I can see if a person's brain has that desensitization and the lack of arousal. Many of the people I work with, the pills don't even work. And if that is happening to a
Jesus.
person, there's significant desensitization.
Thank you for listening to this clip from the full episode of Eyes Wide Open. Please like and subscribe for daily clips and new episodes that drop every Tuesday. I appreciate you.